Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another episode of Fixing the Forgotten, where we discuss the underpowered, underperforming, underwhelming, or underutilized units, lords, heroes, and regiments of renown of a given faction, and what could be done to make them more appealing, both in multiplayer as well as competitive play, and even to an extent in single player, because of course any benefit that, or most benefits that would occur in single or multiplayer would also affect these units in single player as well. And this time around, we are going to be discussing the faction, the roster that I have been dreading by far the most when I started doing this series. And that is the Dowie. And to be quite straight with you guys, it's because the Dowie roster is garbage. Now, that might sound a bit extreme. Many of you will say, but the Dwarfs can function. They are competitive. They can fight any faction and win, even Skaven. Especially, and this is true, especially if you watch top tier Dwarf players such as Amove Hacker, Yumi's, players like that, play a good chunk of Dwarfs. You will see that they can take on anybody, and even the Skaven, which is probably the worst matchup for the Dowie, they can take on them. The problem is that the Dowie roster is like the amount of functional or viable units on the Dowie roster is very, very limited. There's a huge swath of units you will never see. The vast majority of the lords are lords you will never see. I would say all 4 legendary lords are basically trash. The two generics, one is super niche, one is basically the insta-lock, no matter the matchup. Of your heroes, 2 out of 3 are terrible. You have your sub-faction, all 4 of the heroes are basically useless because they're telegraphed a mile away, and they're stupidly overpriced. Because of the fact that dwarves are an infantry-heavy army and they aren't able to control and deal with monsters in any way except shooting, this does mean that then the faction has to build around its shooting. You always will have a mass of very wide shooting in a dwarven build. It's always going to be cannons, thunders, cheaper shooting like rangers and quarrelers. And then you need to protect that shooting. You don't have a mobile army, so what are you going to do? You're going to buy a bunch of cheap trash. You're going to bring dwarf warriors, you're going to bring miners. Occasionally you throw in a longbeard or 2 to get extra sturdiness. The only real variation on that is that the dwarves go super wide and Vanguard in your face. And this is a meta that's persisted now for ages. This was the meta back in Warhammer 1, really. It's been the meta throughout the duration of Warhammer 2. The only real variation in Warhammer 2 is the fact that dwarves did get some buffs to their mass, which made them a little more resilient to chariot abuse. And the Thane was briefly competitive when he was given the Tormentor Sword, which at the time was pretty solid and made him a decent alternative to the Runesmith, which he no longer is. So there's a lot to unravel here. There's a lot to discuss. I'm just going to try to dive right in and start with the lords, because we have a lot of lords to cover. You've got lots of units to cover. This will probably be a lengthy video, and I apologize for those of you who might have been hoping I'd be brief. I will try to keep things a little neat and tidy, but it's going to be tough because there's a lot in the Dwarven roster that are just not competitive because of the different synergies, because of different issues. First and foremost is Thorgrim Grudgebearer, the face of the Dowie army, the face of the race. When you think of the Dowie, you think of Thorgrim rocking around on his throne, writing down grudges, ordering his troops to go settle those grudges, and cracking skulls along the way with the Axe of Grimnir. Now, in practice, you're never going to bring Thorgrim because he sucks. And why does Thorgrim suck? So, Thorgrim, I would argue, is one of the closer lords to decent balance at the moment for the dwarves. One of the big problems with him is the fact that one of his main selling points right now, his main selling point is the fact that he's just tanky, which is not really that great for dwarves because all dwarf lords are tanky. Most enemies will not try to snipe you out, and if anything, the fact that Thorgrim is mounted on a big mount makes him a little more susceptible to monster sniping. That said, he does have a few other niche benefits, such as magical attacks, and he's got some insane buffs for units' melee stats. The problem is that Dowie melee, the elite Dowie melee builds that would have to benefit, that you would need to really benefit from this, that to really benefit from Thorgrim's buffs, are basically non-existent. These are builds that don't really occur. You never see these builds, really. Because the dwarves, like we mentioned before, struggle against elite units, they can't really afford to bring elite troops to the field. And personally, I think if Thorgrim was, if the situation was a bit different, if you actually had proper melee counters to enemy large play, you would probably see Thorgrim a lot more. So Personally, what would I say? What would I say Thorgrim could see fixed? Now, he also does have magic attacks, which I should mention, which does help against ethereals. Dwarfs don't have much magic, despite being like the faction that wields magic, rune-imbued weapons. They have almost none of them in their roster, and no way of granting them, which is stupid in its own right. But skipping out on that, I do think that one of the things that could be that is definitely also beneficial on Thorgrim is that he does get these magic attacks. But what could be done to buff him before we discuss buffing peripheral troops, because we will be discussing revamping some of the melee roster for the Dwarves as well. So first and foremost, I think you could use a price cut. Thorgrim right now, fully kitted out, you're looking at about 2,200 gold. At a decently kitted Rune Lord, you're probably looking at 1,400. In a roster that has to scrape together points to just get the width it needs to survive, plus it needs that crowd control that the Rune, Wrath, and Ruin provides. For a roster like that, you need money. You need to scrape for every penny. And the fact that that Thorgrim Grudgebearer, that the High King is so expensive, is crippling. And for once, because his buffs are so very strong, and I think a lot of them would be better if the Dwarven melee lineup was a bit more competitive, I do think that the best fix for Thorgrim would be a bit of a cut in price. 100 gold could be a decent start. Personally, I think about 200 gold would probably be the way to go and would definitely improve him by a significant amount. Another benefit I think could occur. Now, this is one of the big problems. Now, a High King buff, it's much easier. So Lewin has an equivalent buff to this. It's called the Beloved Son of Bertonia, I believe. Unless that's his heal. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the Beloved Son, though. Where he grants a similar, essentially frenzy to his entire army when he's below 50% HP. The problem is that Lewin is often used very aggressively. He'll dive into an enemy backline. He'll get bludgeoned over the head. You're going to get frenzy for your entire army. With Thorgrim, your opponent is probably not going to snipe Thorgrim most of the time, unless you do some like really wonky build and try to rush into melee, which I have done and have seen it proc occasionally because of that. But in the vast majority of cases, you're not going to see the High King buff go off. Your opponent is not going to try to snipe you. He's not going to try to pressure you. So what I would personally like to see the High King buff become, and I understand that it would become stronger than Lewin's variant. Perhaps it would also come with an increase in cost if we did this. But one thing I would like to see done for the High King buff is give it some sort of benefit when Thorgrim is above 50% HP. My personal take is that it would be a melee defense and charge defense buff. It would give, say, expert charge defense plus, say, 9 melee defense to all units within, say, 55 meter radius of him. And then if he drops below 50%, it would swap to a map-wide effect. You lose that +9, or it wouldn't necessarily be, say, the same ability. You'd have like High King 1 and High King 2 or whatever. But one ability is active when he's above 50%. One ability is active when he's below 50%. So that way you've got a bit more of a guarantee that you're getting some value out of this. Because right now, the chance that you get the value out of High King is very, very minimal, and unfortunately, there just isn't much incentive. The rest of it, I actually think Thorgrim, if he took these price reductions, he would be in a decent spot. The Book of Grudges does have a decent radius. There is a bit of a problem with radius effects, just kind of forcing clumping, which is a little unfortunate. But by and large, I think his kit's all right. It would be nice if he got AP, because it's the Axe of Grimnir. It's like an amazing battle axe. It doesn't really make sense that Thorgrim doesn't have AP. Like, his weapon strength is a bit piddly for sure. I could see him swing towards like 200, 300 or something. Or even taking a cut to his weapon strength, do like 200 to 250 to make him a little more efficient at killing stuff. But really, I think the main issue here is just cut his cost and make it so that High King is a bit more consistent. Because the rest of the buffs, the rest of the things that make Thorgrim more competitive are going to have to come from other troops, from making the Dwarven melee roster more efficient. Next up, we do have Mr. Revenge Incarnate, and he's coming here with Clan Angerund because we did want to talk about the Ghost Ancestors. And this guy is another Lord who I'd say is in a, not a great spot, but he is in a more acceptable position than some of the others. And if we start here, we can see when Bellegar's equipped with the Hammer of Angerund, he does have this permanent massive boost to his melee stats. His plus 15% weapon damage, he's got 16% charge bonus, 9 melee attack. That's a pretty solid buff with the Hammer of Angerund. He's not a terrible lord. He's got Silver Shield, which is pretty nuts. He's got 120 armor, very tanky, insane leadership, expert charge defense. He's got Rally, he's got the Mighty Oathstone, which essentially gives you a better stand your ground effect when you combine these two. Rally is basically the leadership component, with, I believe, a shorter cooldown. And Mighty Oathstone, we can actually compare it to Thorgrim over here if I can get to him. But Stand Your Ground does grant, it's a 90 seconds, 14, and a 90-second cooldown grants 18 seconds of leadership and melee defense. So Mighty Oathstone is essentially that. The defense component just lasts longer, and the rally effect is almost as long and grants that leadership component with a shorter cooldown, which is cool, for sure. Then we do have Revenge Incarnate, which does boost his melee stats by an insane amount. The problem is that Bellegar is just very, very pricey. If he was a budget lord choice where you just bring this guy for some combat stats and some occasional buffage on the front line, it would be all right. It would be, I think, a sort of acceptable an acceptable buff. That said, I do think there could be some other things that could make Bellegar a slightly more appealing lord choice. Some things that could make him a bit more of a bursty support lord, basically like more like a budget Thorgrim is what I'd be thinking. One thing going off his whole shtick is that he's trying to get revenge. He's trying to retake Carrick 8 Peaks. He's trying to get back at all the Skaven and the goblins, freaking Scarsnake and Queek and all them who took away Carrick 8 Peaks from him. He's trying to retake it. So I'd be thinking he could grant some sort of temporary AoE melee attack and charge bonus buff that you could just cast in an area, and it would have, like, say, 100-meter range, and you could drop it. And this, we will be talking a bit about buffing Dwarven melee to make them more competitive in just a little bit. So I think this the idea would be that he would synergize more with his Dwarven melee builds. That he'd be able to buff them, he'd be able to make them move a bit quicker. You could also use this ability if you need to reposition your projectile weapon, your shooting or your artillery a little faster, because sometimes that's important. Having an extra ability like that where you can order your troops to flex around would definitely be nifty. Another option, possibly, could be to grant Bellegar Armor Sundering, because he does have a fancy runic hammer here. He could smack an opponent over the head, sunder their armor, and that could potentially synergize with some of the non-AP Dwarven infantry, like, say, Longbeards. You could put him in a blob of Longbeards and perhaps trade better with a unit or maybe out-trade a unit like Saurus, or beat down a unit that would normally not, that Longbeards would normally not be able to take on, or maybe help Rangers do more damage. So I could see buffs like that being applied to Bellegar, just so that he'd synergize a little bit better. So he'd bring some new benefits to the Dwarf roster. And I will say that, say, Armor Sundering is definitely a bit limited in scope with a foot hero or lord. It's difficult to get good results out of it. It's true for the Pure Main Company. It's true for the Peak Gate Guard, which we'll discuss in just a little bit. But it would be, I think that with Bellegar, because he's a little more flexible than an entire unit, could be a decent buff. Otherwise, giving some Frenzy would be nice. And of course, price cuts would be good. Next up, we do have Ungrim Ironfist, and this is the first of the two Ragey Dwarves. And I will say that I actually think the Dwarf Lord, who I don't have here, is in a decent spot. And I will I think he's like where the budget option should be for the Dwarves. I think he's like the real budget option, so that's why he doesn't make the cut here. Though he's definitely not that popular. But Ungrim Ironfist. So Ungrim is, of course, the Slayer King. He's got insane armor. He's got very high weapon strength. Though in this situation, he's being buffed by Forge Fire, so keep in mind his normal weapon strength is 400, and he's got 430 weapon strength. Right now, it's being buffed by quite a bit, thanks to that Rune Priest who's sitting around somewhere. He's got a bunch of crazy buffs to make him more effective. He's got at killing stuff. So personal buffs, he's got Red Ruin, he's got Death Blow, he's got Axe of Dargo, all of which increases damage output straight up. Red Ruin actually drops your melee defense temporarily. Then he's got Foe Seeker as well as Deadly Onslaught. Now the problem with Ungrim is that he looks like a beast who should be able to murderize enemy at large. The problem is that Ungrim will get pinballed in true small lord fashion. That's definitely a bit of a problem. The other problem is that Ungrim is kind of slow. For a Slayer King, for a guy who's supposed to be like the mad dwarf who's hunting monsters, he only was at 32 speed, which is the standard, I believe, for dwarf lords. Or I guess the Thane's at 30. I guess Thorgrim's at 30. because his dwarf carriage there is not that mobile. But everybody else has 32 speed. So Ungrim is slow. He's not quick. He's not as fast as Slayers. He's not able to keep up with Slayers. And in turn, he's also not able to keep up with, say, debuffed Cav. Like if your Dragonbacks or your Rune Lord snares an enemy, Ungrim often isn't fast enough to get to him, really. So one thing I could see is giving Ungrim a buff to mobility. Just make him a little faster. Another option, I think, would be, because he's of course constantly just searching for that glorious death. Well, there's really two options I can see. One would be some ability called Oath Fulfilled, and in fact, both these abilities, I'm not entirely sure if CI can execute them, but it is what I would prefer to straight price cut. Otherwise, Ungrim, who apparently had ridiculous stats on tabletop, could also get more melee defense, especially bump that melee defense up into like the 50s, or even this up to like 60, because he's supposed to be an insane duelist. But there are two options I could see outside of that. One, glorious, some sort of thing that goes with glorious death. If Ungrim dies, your entire army would not say, for example, not suffer the leadership penalty. You'd retain your given leadership for losing, despite losing your lord, and maybe your entire army would then gain like +5 melee defense or melee attack or something, because you've got this Oath Fulfilled thing. Definitely, at very least, I could see that no leadership penalty would be an interesting take on it. Just make it so Ungrim is a no risk lord, or you're not worried about losing Ungrim. That would definitely be pretty cool. Another option I could see is some sort of Hunter of Champions effect. And what I would like to see, rather than a Hunter of Champions, this is an effect I haven't seen anywhere else in this game, but one that would specifically target single entities. So it could target heroes, it could target lords, it could target monsters. And it would slow them by, say, 36%. It would be like some sort of mark for, or Slayer's mark or whatever. And it would mark a target, it would slow them down by, say, 36%, reduce their melee defense by like 10, and increase Ungrim, or maybe not even reduce their melee defense, to be honest, because you don't necessarily need that, but give Ungrim a burst of speed. So no matter where Ungrim is, he can now approach faster, and you are slowed. And it would be an interesting synergy, I think, because it would help other dwarf units deal with monsters or single entities like lords on chariots. It wouldn't apply that slow to every unit, so it wouldn't be like a Rune of Wrath and Ruin that can literally crowd control a chariot unit. But at the same time, I think it would give you a little more utility if you need to slow, say, Malekith rampaging around. If there's a Vargulf running amok, Ungrim could help out with that, and he could actually target it a bit better. Finally, we do have everyone's raging uncle, and this guy, crazy Papa Gromby, I think is actually, once again, pretty damn close to being good. There's a few little things I would like to comment on, though. So Flash Bomb got buffed and reworked a bit in the last patch. Is much better now. Definitely very solid, sort of slow. Foe Seeker, it's all right. The main critique here is his items, in my opinion. His stats could definitely be better. They're actually, I believe, worse in most ways than Grimgor's. And Grimgor's stats are pitiful, in my opinion. I already mentioned that Grimgor is not very good in an earlier video. So if we compare them, you can see, granted, Gromby does have more leadership, even baseline, even without the added effects of other stuff around him. He does, of course, have slightly greater HP, that sort of thing, but not the charge bonus. He doesn't have quite the melee defense of Grimgor. And one of the biggest things here is that a lot of his items are just not very good. So one, Grombrindal has no fear. This only affects your units before they break. It doesn't halt break, and this is a problem might extend to like Light of Battle, Unbreakable. But what I would like to see is Grombrindal has no fear, instantly breaking retreat. It could be granted, the duration could easily be cut to half. I'd say 16-second duration, no problem. I don't see a reason why units should be unbreakable for 32 seconds. But instantly breaks units retreat and grants unbreakable for, say, 16 seconds. I could see that make the Grombrindal has no fear a much more effective ability to rally your troops. If you're in like a critical situation where your opponent happened to get a good charge off that broke a portion of your line, now they're fleeing for dear life, you're able to pop Grombrindal has no fear, rally your troops. And I think you could see that being useful. Next problem, Rune Realm Zufbar, kind of a stupid item. Dwarves generally don't have leadership issues. Whatever leadership issues you have, you kind of already have Grombrindal has no fear to counter that. So Rune Realm Zufbar is just kind of bad. You're never going to take this item, because who cares about 12 leadership on dwarves? Now what could be done to buff it or to make it a little more competitive, well, that's a good question if I ever saw one. I think the item would basically need a total overhaul from ground up because it's just not a very good item for leadership. Who gives a darn? You get like dwarfs don't break. It's just a fact of life. So what could be done to buff the rune helm? One, it could be given immunity psychology. That would honestly be more valuable than 12 leadership. Another potential option would be to make the Runehelm Sufbar have the old hold the line effect on top of it, which granted extra mass to units. It granted extra charge resistance, which is effectively more mass to units when they were braced. This would make it more difficult for your opponent to breach portions of the line with chariots, for example. Though Grombrindal already kind of does that with his smoke bomb, so I'm not sure that's really what you necessarily want. Otherwise, perhaps dropping the benefit on the leadership to it, and providing some alternative boosts to your dwarves as well. Maybe a slight charge bonus boost so you can make him work with alongside great weapons a bit better. Something along those lines, but definitely something that the leadership is just not very relevant in my opinion. Smoke Bomb's great. I think it's in a good spot. Rune Axe of Grombrindal, I just think the cooldown should be way lower. I could easily see it having a cooldown and melee requirement, but 120 seconds for Discouraged and 40% AP compared to for 26 seconds compared to Grimgor's. If we look at Gitsnik here, Grimgor gets 18 seconds every 30 seconds he's in melee. Gitsnik, which is a huge difference. It's a really quite huge gap, and I'd rather see. Even if it was a 60 seconds, because Discouraged is a pretty potent effect. But I would much rather like to see that Rune Axe Grombrindal gets a buff and cooldown there. Otherwise, Grombrindal and honestly all the Dwarf Legendary Lords could just use a price cut. And that is just what it is. That's what they kind of need. Next up, we will actually touch on something here for the Rune Lord, who, although I've extolled him for being stupidly good, he does have some actually pretty derpy and ridiculous items, in my opinion. Gatekeeper's Belt, definitely a bit crappy if he's on foot, but it has a bit more benefit if he's mounted, so it's not the worst item, in my opinion. That said, Rune of Hearth and Home, but especially Forge Fire is kind of trash. Forge Fire is also available on Runesmiths. It grants plus 10 AP damage, and plus 10%, sorry, AP damage. But as dwarves, you're usually not bringing great weapons to begin with. Even if you are, the effect is only 40 meters wide, and it doesn't affect non-AP. So generally, your front line will be non-AP. So it has very few uses. In my opinion, it would be nice if Forge Fire granted plus 10% to all damage types, or both non-AP and AP, within a 55 meter AoE. Otherwise, it could even grant, and this would probably come with a price increase, it could also grant magic damage in a 55 meter AoE, which I think would be really cool. It would make your troops, currently dwarves, while they themselves are not necessarily the most susceptible to ethereal units because they've got magic resistance. And that's something I'd like to see changed. I think the dwarf magic resistance thing is stupid, but that's for another time. But if it granted magic damage, it would give the dwarf some proper counter to ethereal troops, in my opinion. And it still wouldn't be like you can just help your entire line. You still have a relatively static lord providing his magic aura, but it would give the dwarves at least something to fight back against, say, hex rates, Cairn rates, that sort of thing. Besides that, we do have our heroes, and that's who we'll be moving on to next. And as I mentioned before, these guys are definitely in a bit of a pickle. So there are two, in my opinion. Well, how to do this. Let's touch on the ghost heroes because I think there's just a general issue here. These guys are exclusive to Clan Angrund. They all cost 400 gold more than their vanilla variant. And besides that, they've got the same kit. The only variation is the Thane. So if we look at the vanilla Thane here, keep in mind he is being buffed by a whole bunch of stuff, so the stats aren't necessarily accurate. But the Thane is has slightly different stats than the two Ghost Thanes. One Ghost Thane is like the tank. He's got much higher melee defense and a silver shield. The other one is like the Bruiser, I guess. Both of them suck at killing stuff anyway, but whatever. One of them is the Bruiser. He's got a higher charge bonus. He's got a bronze shield, higher melee attack, all that shenanigans, all that jazz. But besides that, all these here, all the ghost heroes have the same items as their vanilla variants. They're just ethereal. The problem is at the moment you see your opponent pick Angrund, you immediately know they're probably going to run ethereal, or at very least you should bring like a single item that counters ethereal troops. The thing is, dwarves don't have healing. The dwarf ancestor do not have an innate healing, and they're incredibly easy to smack with spirit leeches, fireballs, or just ignore and whittle down later, because they're very immobile for an ethereal unit too. Like at least a banshee is pretty nippy. Same with the green knight; they can flex around a bit. Granted, not ideally, but they can. Especially Banshee is pretty cheap for what she delivers. But even the Green Knight at 2,000, as I mentioned before, not a fan of the Green Knight, but he's still able to flex around a lot more, which is just not at all the case for the or the Damned Paladin for that matter, much nippier. But that's just not the case for these Dwarf Ancestors. So I think just a straight price cut is needed here, and we'll talk about items in a bit, but I think a straight price cut of like 200 gold at minimum is needed. They do provide Fear and Terror, which dwarves don't have access to otherwise, which I think is worth noting or not forgetting about. But despite that, they're often squishier than their normal brethren, simply because your opponent predicts them. They have got no armor. They've got tiny HP pools of 2,000. Like we look at, say, a Master Engineer here, compare him to his special variant. He's got 1,000 less HP, 120 armor on the normal Engineer as well, which it's a huge gap. Same with the Thane. He's got over 1,000 advantage, and he still has that armor. So keep in mind that the armor is a huge protective barrier. It'll even mitigate AP weapons. Plus, you also have the benefit of magic resist on your vanilla guys, as well as missile resist. So you're not even a lot of the project stuff that will kill that is Ghost Ancestors are already resistant or very resistant to. Your vanilla guys aren't that weak to either, and they do have that benefit of not being that snipeable. So yeah, Angry Ancestors kind of suck. So I think a big price cut to them would be very nice. Otherwise, a boost to HP, in my opinion. We'll get to items in a bit because I want to discuss redoing items for some of the heroes as well. But yeah, their items blow. So, but on some of these guys, but I definitely do think that a boost to HP, say 400 or 500 HP, would actually put them in a much more better spot because they're so easily telegraphed. They're so visible. You know they're coming. That and a 200 gold cut to price, and I think that would put them in a much better spot. Finally, this is a bit more of a nitpick or cherry pick, but the engineer hero, Drummer Hammerfist, should have magic projectiles. I'm not entirely sure why he doesn't, but I assume it's a mistake. And in my opinion, should be rectified. Which does get us on to the heroes, and yeah, we're finally getting somewhere. So there's two heroes, in my opinion, that are not very good. The Thane as well as the engineer. Thane's it used to be somewhat competitive when he had Tormentor Sword, but that was removed. Now he's simply got the Rune of Slowness, which debuffs enemy speed by 18%. He does have Foe Seeker. He also has some pretty crummy abilities. He's got the Ironbeard's Ring, which weakens enemies to fire, which has very little synergy. The Dwarf roster does have a few fire units, but not that many. Especially not enough to... It's not good enough to just bring the Thane for that alone. And the Silverhorn of Vengeance grants plus 12 charge bonus, which is pretty abysmal, mostly because you're probably only getting... First of all, Dwarf melee bolts aren't that good to begin with. But second of all, it requires great timing. It's like the Goblin Fanatics. Like, you need to have good timing with this one. It's not like WoW where you're just focused on your Lord, you sort of A-move your army and hit WoW, and boom, you've got a charge bonus boost. Plus, you need to position this guy. It's only got a 40-meter range, which is kind of ridiculous. Personally, I'd like to see the benefit of Silverhorn to be buffed. Like, even if it came as a slight price increase, make it buff your troops by damage output by like 10% or 20% in an area around him. Would just make it a little more viable, or give that Dwarven Assault a little more burst. Or make your troops move a little bit faster. And anything besides just will still have charge bonus would, in my opinion, be a nice improvement there. Rune of Slowness, in my opinion, could also be... So, Rune of Slowness, in my opinion, could be ditched for an item. So in the campaign, the Dwarves have an item that grants Frostbite. And for forget what the item is called. It's been a while since I played Dwarves in campaign, admittedly. But I know that you can craft an item that grants Frostbite. So it would be cool if you could give the Thane an item that allows him to make it activatable, but an activatable item that gives him Frostbite. So that way he could really slow enemies down. Maybe ditch the Rune of Slowness in favor of that. But something that you can combine with, say, Dragonback Slayers to cripple your opponent's mobility, at least for a little bit, if you get a few swings in. Or maybe make the Rune of Slowness something that's activatable. One of the things I really worry about is that if you gave the Rune of Slowness too much of a buff, then it would become impossible to outrun a combo of Dragonback Slayers and Thane. You get too close to them and you're done. You'd lose like a unit of light cav guaranteed, much less heavy cav or monsters. And that's not something we want to see, in my opinion. So it's why I would recommend making either the Rune of Slowness activatable with a greater effect, or give some sort of Frostbite effect to the Thane. Ironbeam's Ring could stay around. It's like a funny little niche item, but I think the Thane needs buffs elsewhere to make him a little more competitive. Once again, I think that if the Dwarves had a general buff to their melee prowess, he would also become more capable then, and he might be more popular. Finally, we do have the Master Engineer, and this guy, well, he's got some really derpy and stupid items and abilities. First and foremost, the good stuff. Firing of Thori, decent enough spell. It's a bit of a narrow breath, but it does grant you some magic damage. You get 3 casts. It's got an alright cooldown. It's not bad. Like it's not amazing, and it's certainly not bring the engineer. It's not worth bringing the engineer just to get a fire ring. But it's all right. Like it's an item that's pretty solid. His other decent item here or ability is Ballistics Calibration, which grants 30% accuracy and 20 reload skill. Which, you know, it's all right. 32 seconds. As I've done a video before, reload skill has a huge boost. You're looking at like 22% increase in rate of fire for a lot of units. So if you pop this near your cannons or organs, you're going to get a huge boost to rate of fire plus accuracy. Very solid. Honestly, I can't complain. The problem is that the engineer is very expensive. He also has a lot of derpy abilities, like Entrenchment. Prevents your units from moving. It's self-net. It grants physical resist, which generally on your artillery is just not worthwhile. It does boost the AP damage, which is nice, but just not that good. And he's also got the Prospector Spyglass, which grants extra accuracy. And that's generally not important because dwarf units are already very precise. And finally, he's got extra powder, which is incredibly stupid because it doesn't work with most of your black powder weapons, or actually almost, I don't even know if it works with any of them. Because it only affects explosion damage. So it doesn't affect cannons, who don't have an explosion. It doesn't affect thunders. I think it affects like troll hammers and iron drakes and units like that. But it's definitely a bit of a dumb improvement, given that it doesn't affect units that use black powder, really. So personally, and one of the big problems is that the engineer is very expensive. You bring him to buff artillery, but you're essentially giving up an entire cannon, and then some, to get a engineer on the field. And his actual combat prowess is not that good. Like, sure, he does some damage over time. He gets 180 AP damage, 180 range. It's okay. He can ship, I'd say, an enemy lord. But he often misses. He's not that precise. He's relatively easily shut down. Like we mentioned, you're giving up an entire cannon battery to get this guy. So if he's not delivering, you're in trouble. So what can be done to fix him? Well, first and foremost, I do think that extra powder is stupid and should be redone. I think extra powder should grant, and actually, I think the Skaven engineer gets it as well, which is kind of derpy. I think the extra powder ability should grant more damage to all ranged units nearby, period. And perhaps also buff projectile velocity, which would be a cool synergy. It would make it harder to dodge your shots, which is important. Oftentimes top tier players will juke, and that is very annoying to see. So if extra powder granted, say, plus 20% projectile speed, plus 10, and then plus 10% damage across the board for both explosion as well as projectile damage, that would be a huge boost, in my opinion, and would instantly help the engineer a bit. Make him you put him between 2 cannons. That's another problem. You have to blob around him, which is frustrating. So you put him between some cannons, and it would make him a bit it would make him a bit tankier. Or sorry, it would make your range do a little bit more damage. I'm already thinking of entrenchment here. But for entrenchment, which is the other kind of weak item here, or well, actually the spyglass is also pretty weak, but going on to the entrenchment. So you have to target a unit specifically. It gives it physical resist, which and AP missile damage. The problem is the synergy there is kind of limited. Like, and you root yourself for 44 seconds, which is an insanely long time. What I'd probably prefer doing, especially given that the engineer already is kind of forcing you to blob up a bit, is make it so that at least the buffs are decent. Make it so entrenchment grants your units in an AoE a boost to say it's a 44% honestly physical resist boost. It could easily be much high, in my opinion, much higher than what it is. So let's say it grants 44% physical resist boost, and then plus 40% AP as it does now. And then on top of that, it just slows your units by, say, 36 or 48%. Not a full immobilization, because the fact that you get fully immobilized is crippling. It makes this an incredibly unreliable ability to use on artillery. I can only think of one game where I've ever actually used this and gotten good value. It was on Arnhem, specifically, because my opponent literally just bum rushed me. So I had plenty of time to take advantage of entrenchment, but you can't count on that in most games. Otherwise, if I happen to take the engineer, the only time I remember using entrenchment is to boost my melee line to give it more physical resist, which is kind of dumb. So I think it would be cool if it was like an AoE buff, more in line with the runes, with something like the runesmith grants with rune of negation, and the duration could be cut down for sure. The duration would not have to be that long. Finally, Prospector Spyglass. This one is plus 18% accuracy, is so derpy. I think more range would be very nice. Granting all units nearby extra range and accuracy would be awesome. Making your Thunders reach out, let's say an extra 10 or 15 meters would be cool. And keep in mind, some of these buffs might sound extreme, but keep in mind, when you bring an engineer kitted out like this, you're paying essentially 2 Thunderers worth, or like a cannon and a half worth, to get this guy on the field. So if he's not paying for himself, he needs to be paying for himself somehow. So otherwise, dog crap. Otherwise, the only other alternative here that I'm seeing is a huge drop in cost by probably 300 or 400, because that is how bad the engineer is right now. But I definitely think buffs like that would be much more nice to see. And with that, we're out of the heroes. So that's a tough part of the video down, and we're on to units. And this is, I think, where things will get a little smoother. So you can see we've got some units you guys might be a little surprised to see here. Not all these units are actually here because I think they're bad. Dwarf Warriors and Longbeards, Slayers. I actually think they're very competitive. I just want to have them here as a comparison. First and foremost, Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. And this is, in my opinion, a unit that's just a bit overpriced, honestly. One of the big problems is the melee attack's terrible. 22 melee attack on a great weapon unit is atrocious. They struggle to hit. Sure, they've got slightly better charge bonus and better weapon strength, with obviously the majority of that being AP, which is nice. They've essentially got the inverse of AP, non-AP to Dwarf Warriors. But, and for their price point, they do hit relatively hard. The problem is that you're almost never going to see these guys trade cost efficiently. You put them up against like Chaos Warriors with great weapons, and you take like 2,000 HP off the Chaos Warriors with great weapons and lose the unit. Trading a 500 unit that you're basically you're basically getting 300 gold back, which is really cost inefficient when you think about it. And against more elite enemy heavy infantry, the problem with these guys is their melee attack is so low that they can't hit consistently. So something like Swordmasters, even Chosen, Hammers, again, you're not likely to see that sort of match. But like if you fought Hammers, for example, Harganth Executioners, elite infantry like that will simply cleave through your Dwarf Warriors, and they are not going to do much damage in return because they just have such a bad melee attack. Now, granted, it's a little better against, say, Black Orcs, but Black Orcs hit a lot harder. You get a big drop to your melee defense because it's only at 30. And, yeah, so the big problem is that these guys, they cost 50 more than Dwarf Warriors. As we just discussed, their cost efficiency is not there. They're far more vulnerable than Dwarf Warriors. They don't have immunity. They don't have charge defense against large. They don't have a shield. They're missing 10 melee defense. And as we've discussed before, dwarf meta is to focus on your shooting. Dwarf warriors with great weapons are taking away gold that would be better spent on your shooting, because ultimately the killing is going to have to be done by your shooting because these guys' stats are just not good enough. Like, certainly I'm sure there's some matchups where these guys might perform up, like, in a cost-efficient manner. Maybe against, like, Graveguard with great weapons, though even there I'm not really sold on it. But I'm sure there might be some where these guys can dish out a bit more hurt. But in general, they just don't deliver. Because oftentimes they're going to be thrown against AP units that armor is wasted. Otherwise, the fact of the matter is that the AP is wasted if you're throwing them against chaff, which sometimes does happen with dwarves. So, personally, there's a few ways you could take this. I think personally, just a price cut should be applied, and I think these guys could easily be 50 gold cheaper. I think that at worst they're like equal with dwarf warriors. I don't. Or at best, sorry, they're equal with Dwarf Warriors. Arguably, for the roster as a whole, they've got reduced utility. Otherwise, I would like to see them granted a bit more melee attack. Bump it up to like 24. It doesn't even have to be a crazy high melee attack, but make it a little more competitive. Plus 1 or 2, believe it or not, can make all the difference in the world sometimes, and making you a little more competitive at hitting slightly more consistently. And that would be just a buff I would like to see. Just make the Dwarf Warriors a tiny bit more with great weapons, a tiny bit more appealing. Because right now, if you're going to go with a budgeted great weapon, you're going to go with the Dwarves. You really want great weapons. You're going to bring Longbeards with great weapons because they've got charge defense against large. They've got better melee defense than your Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. Like they do have 10 less melee defense than Longbeards, but Longbeards with great weapons will trade pretty cost effectively with a lot of enemy infantry. They've got that charge defense against large, immunity to psychology, so they can really tango with big or tie up bigger monsters or cavalry, especially a bit more effectively than dwarf warriors with great weapons can. And in my opinion, that's just unfortunate. And so I would like to see dwarf warriors made a little cheaper. I just don't see them as better than vanilla dwarf warriors, despite the fact that they've got that AP trade, because you lose so much survivability. And usually when you're going wide, you want that survivability just to hold up for your shooting. Next up, we've got the Warriors of Dragonfire Pass, unit that I think is just slightly overpriced, which is odd for a Regiment of Renown. But if we compare them to a unit of standard Longbeards, which is what we're doing here, keep in mind that the Warriors of Dragonfire Pass get a bonus versus infantry of 6. So against infantry, and this is usually what these units will fight. Longbeards or Warriors of Dragonfire Pass will usually be fighting infantry. The problem is that Warriors of Dragonfire Pass do have, and you can see the Longbeards actually buffing them here with Encourage, which is kind of amusing. But Warriors of Dragonfire Pass do have the same leadership as Longbeards, but they've got less armor. They've got significantly less HP, 600 less. They've got a little more melee defense and a little more melee attack, which is nice. Less weapon strength overall. They don't have immunity to psychology, though. They don't provide that Encourage aura. Quite frankly, the thing is, I just think Warriors of Dragonfire Pass are like 50 gold overpriced. I could see them as being on par with Longbeards, where you trade off a little bit of damage output and raw survivability for utility stats on the Longbeards. But as a straight upgrade, I don't see these guys as a straight upgrade compared to Longbeards. Arguably, they're a downgrade. So I think these guys should be like 650. Which does take us on to hammers. And this is really a unit where it's a bit of a troublemaker, and this extends to PK guard, but hammers on paper have very solid melee stats. They're an all-rounder great weapon unit that hits like a truck, has the highest weapon strength of any unit or of any infantry unit in the game. Weapon strength that's roving into heavy like top tier heavy cav or zones. 55 weapon strength is almost on par with Crypt Horrors. They've got very high melee attack at 46, melee defense at 35. It's actually not bad at all for a great weapon unit. Blackworks only have 26. Certainly, they're not on par with, say, Chosen with great weapons if we compare them with Chosen. But keep in mind, Chosen are much more expensive. So what's the problem with hammers? Well, the problem is that they don't synergize well with the dwarf roster, and the dwarves are not able to control big monsters from running amok. Now, as we discussed before, potential buffs to our heroes and lords to give them a bit more control, crowd control options, snaring runes, specific targeted debuffs to prevent enemies from escaping, stuff like that would definitely help. I think make the hammers a little more appealing, because you could suddenly maybe control your opponent a little better. But one of the things I actually thought was, what if these guys were given some sort of concussive blow effect with their melee attacks? And we're looking at a lot of slows here for the dwarves, so I apologize, but it's make it something that slows your opponent. Look at these massive hammers. Like, this should basically be a maul, really. Like, this is what a real warhammer looks like. But these guys could get some sort of effect where if they hit an enemy, they slow them by 36%. This would not affect their performance against infantry, because this is something we want to be wary of. If you overbuff hammers, if you make them too cheap, or buff them in some way that say debuffs enemy combat stats, they're going to be, or makes their stats like really crazy good, they're just going to be overperforming against infantry, like completely broke OP against them, and not still trash against big stuff. And that's not really the balance that I think we should be seeing here with the hammers. And what I do think would be cool would be to see the hammers given a snare effect on impact. I think it would be cool to see. It would help them slow and control enemy monsters, control enemy chariots a little bit better. It would help them synergize with the slayers, and give you an alternative. Make it so that you're not forced into this boring slayer plus cheap trash frontline meta that the dwarven match is predominantly covered by. Right now, if your opponent plows through with, say, chariots and goes for backline, they're going to get through, because hammers don't have charge defense. Even if they're braced, they're going to get pushed through, and they might get a few swings in, but it's not going to do much. But if you can slow your opponent, snare them, make them be an easier target for your shooting, brace up, that sort of thing, make the hammers, in my opinion, much more efficient there. And I think that would be a nice buff, just to give them a little more versatility without making them overbearing against infantry. Next up, we do have the Peak 8 Guard. I'm actually going to touch on them before I touch on Giant Slayers. But a Peak 8 Guard, well, one of the problems, and I mentioned this earlier, is that infantry that has armor sundering, so these guys, Regiment of Renowned Hammers, they get magic attacks, rare on the dwarven roster, definitely nice to see. Immunity Psychology, always a good trait. And they get armor sundering, which is really the big selling point here, besides, I guess, the tier 9 stats. The problem is that armor sundering on a melee unit that it's on foot and can't really choose its fights very effectively is not that good. It's good on a unit like Rusty Errors that can pick a target, or the Legion of Demonetization. You pick a target, weaken it, gun it down. The problem is that on the Dwarf roster, you get stuck against the unit like Sister of Slaughter with these guys, and you get nothing out of armor sundering. Oftentimes you will get very little, if nothing, out of armor sundering, because you're not fighting the units you need to be targeting with your shooting, or you're running thunders anyway. So the armor sundering effect is just, in my opinion, not that useful. It's very difficult to make use out of. Obviously, further price cuts for these guys could make them better, especially if we see other buffs improving the viability with slows, and of infantry with slows and snares, and the concussive effect, which I think these guys would receive if normal hammers got it. But otherwise, I do think that the armor sundering effect is just not that useful, and I would like to see it sort of swapped out, perhaps, for something else. So if we look at the hammers here, obviously one of the problems is that if we put the hammers in with, like, say, Guardian, because they're like the guard unit, that's probably not what you want to see, because then you'll see like a Doom box with like a Rune Lord and these guys. I can see why CA would be wary of that. But for example, an Inspire on attack effect, or when in melee effect, where they would improve the nearby troop stats, and instead of being an encourage effect, it would be like +5 melee attack, or something small, or relatively small, something of that nature. Obviously, or something that would boost nearby units' melee defense, because they're all steadfast and stuff. But something to give them a little more utility. And the idea here behind a lot of these buffs is simply to make the dwarven melee rush, or make dwarven melee a bit more appealing, a bit more viable, a bit more functional. Because right now, essentially, so much of the dwarven melee roster is cut out because the dwarves must bring massive shooting, and that's the idea behind a lot of these changes I'm proposing. Finally, Giant Slayers, and these guys are simply overpriced. One of the big problems is they are competing directly with Dragonback Slayers, essentially, within the cost department. First, yeah, it's stupid. It's casting entrenchment. But Dragon Slayers, Dragonback Slayers, they've got a slow, which is the most important thing here, the power of the Dragonback. They slow enemies. They've got very good melee stats, much better than Giant Slayers. Sure, they don't hit as hard, but they do also have that shield save. Otherwise, if you're looking for budget Slayers to just defend against crappy trash units that are harassing your backline, normal Slayers, much better. And ultimately, to kill any heavy stuff, you're going to need shooting, because chariots and most big monsters will just plow past your Giant Slayers and ignore them. So in my opinion, Giant Slayers are still too overpriced. They cost the same as they cost more than hammers. They cost the same as iron breakers right now. So it would be cool to see them either dropped in price by another 100, or at least 50. Or another option, this is one I've seen pitched around on the forums, is make them a small unit of say 12, like Aspiring Champions, with high mass and say slightly better mobility. Make them a true monster, like a beefy monster hunter unit that's just dedicated to killing monsters. Very tanky, or maybe not even that tanky. Maybe make him like 3,000 HP. Make him like relatively cheap in that sense, but make him like Demi-Griffin heights except on foot and unbreakable, something like that. But a unit that would be very beefy, have higher charge resistance, higher mass, so they can slow enemy cavalry, and would just dish out a lot of hurt in close quarters. So basically the way the original Depth Guard were before they were actually released, or the way Aspiring Champions are right now. And obviously this would have to come with a price rebalancing and all that, but I think it would make Giant Slayers a bit more of a real niche, and especially if hammers did get a sort of concussive effect, it would be nice to see Giant Slayers given this body blocking niche. And would also make them synergize better with the melee rush. You get your Giant Slayers backing your hammers, would be cool to see. And your Slayers would be like your more generic throwaway, mass unit. And that does get us out of infantry and onto shooting. Now here, there's a few. First and foremost, I'm going to touch on the easy fix, or in my opinion, easy fix, Quarrelers with great weapons. In my opinion, they should cost the same as normal Quarrelers. If we compare the stats, Quarrelers trade. Quarrelers have shields, and they've got higher melee defense. Quarrelers with great weapons obviously get AP. They get much higher charge bonus, slightly better melee attack. The problem is that for a shooting unit that's looking to be shooting as much as possible, the stats Quarrelers bring, the shield is far more valuable, really, as is the melee defense. And their melee stats are good enough to clobber cheap trash like Wolf Riders, dogs, that sort of thing. Whereas Quarrelers with great weapons are ironically more vulnerable to those types of units because they have lower melee defense. And the AP is a super sort of niche benefit. And you lose your armor, or you lose your shields, which makes you more vulnerable to missile pressure from anything, whether AP or non-AP damage. In short, these guys are just not... The fact that you're paying more for these guys over Quarrelers is just dumb. And in my opinion, they should be 550, just like normal Quarrelers. Would make them, in my opinion, a bit more appealing. Would make it so you're not worried about, or you're not forced to pay more for a unit whose benefits quite possibly are not going to be utilized in that match. So at least if you have like a plan or a build centered around it, you can get a little more value. If you're, say, looking to zone away skirmishers and then thinking, okay, maybe I'll throw these guys into melee later, there would be a little more appeal. Right now, you're like, I might want to zone and then throw them into melee, but at the same time, I'm going to be taking more missile pressure, and I'm paying more when I could get a bigger front line. So, in my opinion, that would just be a nice trade-off to see. And that brings me to what's one of the most difficult, well, one not so difficult and one very difficult unit here. Iron Drakes, I actually don't think are in that bad of a spot. They're very niche. I have seen them used to great effect. They're pretty damn tanky, relatively cheap. Surprisingly do well against single entities because they do so much damage in a quick burst. They got that burnt effect, which is pretty cool. Might say leadership. Well, leadership debuff's not the most common in Dwarf roster, so nice to see. What I would like to see either granted these guys either cut in cost or give them some sort of ability to ignore obstruction from allies, especially dwarf units because they can tank the burst better. Obviously, it's not that dwarfy of a fix, but it is something that could help these guys out a little bit. Otherwise, barring those fixes, and obviously the idea of price cuts. Another thing I would like to see perhaps is make them a little more disruptive, make it so that they can knock units over a little more effectively. It's a gout of flame. After all, spattering it, like if you're not like batting it away or like kind of freaking out a little bit, it would be a bit surprising. So I feel like if it, obviously the burnt effect is kind of supposed to reflect that, but also make it so it staggers enemies, slows them down a little bit without applying, say, suppression effect. Now, next up, we do have the Scolder Guard, and these guys are in a much worse position, where I think Iron Drakes could just use a slight cut in cost and call it a day. Scolder Guard is pretty terrible. These guys are basically a trash tier Trollhammer Torpedo that costs more than a Trollhammer Torpedo. And I guess you get physical resist as a reward for that. That's a big problem. These cost more than Trollhammer Torpedoes. They don't do as well against big monsters. And they basically do about the same performance as Trollhammers against infantry without the arc. So you can't count on these guys to beat down on enemy infantry, really. Because positioning a unit that's 26 speed is insanely difficult. And you lose out on the burnt down debuff from the Iron Drakes. You do get AP damage, which is kind of nice. But, like, these guys just don't really bring much. So, honestly, their current pricing, these guys probably shouldn't cost more than 700 or 750 gold. They're really grossly overpriced for what they do, for what they deliver to your army. And how to buff them is quite a difficult issue. One thing I could see given to these guys to make them a little more appealing would be to give them armor sundering. It might seem weird, but my logic would be that since these guys are firing gouts of steam, make it so like they're like scalding their opponents and their opponents like stripping off their superheated plate. Granted, it would make more sense to be honest with the normal Iron Drakes to be working like that, but the idea being to make these guys a little more viable. And if they had armor sundering, it's a ranged unit, short range granted, but it is a ranged unit, so it could synergize a bit better with, say, crossbows. The problem at that point is that you're now treading on the toes of Ulthar's Raiders, who are also the debuff kings, and arguably still better because they only cost 750. But at least it would be consistent debuff you could keep applying with armor sundering, which would be kind of cool to see. Otherwise, make it so that they do apply a straight speed debuff on shot. You could use them as more sort of close, and once again, make your offensive builds a little more viable. These guys are short range; they can push in with your troops, make it so that scalding steam is like slowing their opponents down, on hit, slowing them by like 36% or something. And I could see that making the Scolder Guard a little bit more effective. Unfortunately, I don't have much else to say. The problem is that this unit is just such an uncomfortable position, and no matter what, in my opinion, you do, no matter which way you take it in, you're going to end up treading on something's toes. Right now, they're very much in line with Trollhammer Torpedoes, and Trollhammers are just straight better. But you bring them down to earth a bit. You make them cheaper. You're looking at contesting Iron Drakes. You bring them down. You give them debuffs. You're looking at contesting Ulthar's Raiders. Stuff like that. It's definitely a bit of a finicky situation. And how to make these guys, it's such an awesome concept, like Scolder Guard. These guys with their steam guns, they look insane. They've got just gorgeous armoring there. Look even cooler than the normal Iron Drakes for sure. But fact of the matter is, they don't cut the mustard. Their damage output isn't really worth it, I suppose, is what it boils down to. The fact that they also lose the leadership debuff could be an issue. Maybe giving them a separate leadership debuff would also introduce some new interesting synergies for the Dwarves. The ability to say a leadership break with Grombrindal, like say Scalding Burn. Give them an ability that's like Scalding Burns or something, and make it drop enemy leadership by like 8. So then if you hit your opponent with like Iron Drakes, Scolder Guard, and Grombrindal with the Scourge, you can drop your opponent's leadership by like 32 in a burst. And it would be a cool debuff or debuff synergy. But something like that. If you guys have your own opinions on this one, I'd definitely love to hear them, because this is a very difficult unit, in my opinion, to try to make viable. Next up, we do have Dwarven Artillery, and holy heck, this has been going on for a while. But Dwarven Artillery, Organ Gun and Flame Cannon are the 2 units I think are underpowered in the Dwarf roster. Organ Gun basically just comes down to cost. You pay 1100, and if you compare this unit to, say, Jezzail's, it's very difficult to justify that high cost. And personally, I don't think Giselles are actually in that bad of a spot. Definitely need some tweaking. Need to be made a little less effective against artillery. But the Giselles are basically what the organ gun should be against cavalry and units like that. So I think it would be cool to see the organ gun dropped in price. Simply go down to like 1,000 gold. Make it a cheaper option. Giselles, I assume, will still get some nerfs. But organ gun, 1100 is just very difficult to field. One of the big problems is that as dwarves, you can't just bring cheap artillery because you have to bring some cannons. You can't, because if you don't bring, or you need to bring Grombrindal, because you can't afford to have your opponent outshoot you. If you bring a bunch of organ guns and flame cannons, your opponent is going to, if your opponent goes with bolt throwers or empire cannons, they will outshoot you. So you have to bring, at that point, cannons. Or if the opponent brings a hell cannon, they'll pressure you. Like there's someone, or Cygor, and you can't counter them. So you have to bring cannons to begin with. So making it easier to cram in an organ gun or two on top of those cannons would be nice to see. Same thing with flame cannon, just make it a bit cheaper. The flame cannon, nowadays, it can decimate troops. It can annihilate infantry. It's insanely powerful for sure. But the flame cannon is just, well, once again, it's very expensive. 1,250 gold for a unit that's only good against infantry, really. Which isn't that much of a problem for dwarves to begin with. And like I mentioned before, you have to pay for the cannon. So I think that this unit, if we want to make it more legit, like viable, I think it should be dropped in price. Probably to about 1,000 as well. Honestly, this one is easily very overpriced because it's only good against one target. The range is not very good, so it's much easier to shut down with counter battery fire. It's a huge risk, and because of this, you basically never see the unit. And I do think it would be nice to see it buffed by a significant amount. Make it much more viable, much less of a risk. Because right now, except like Norska, where you don't have to worry about enemy artillery really, or any sort of an artillery play. There's not really many matchups where you can safely bring a flame cannon. Maybe Wood Elves, but against the Wood Elves, you've got such short range that you're risking getting shot by Way Watchers pretty early and easily. And sure, you might get some shots back, but then they're going to delete you, and you've lost your very expensive flame cannon. And that's just unfortunate, and it's very difficult to get your returns back on the flame cannon. So I think making it cheaper would be nice. I don't actually think it needs, say, AP majority or anything. It does a lot of damage already, so you don't have to worry about that. It will delete most armored troops pretty effectively, in my experience, because it's just so much damage so quickly. Just a little more, maybe a little more accuracy as well would help, and a slightly higher arc. But besides that, I really just think the main buff this thing needs is cost. And finally, the units you guys no doubt have been waiting for are Gyrocopters. And we've got all variants of them, and that's not because I think most of them are that bad, but it's just because there's a specific feature on them that I think needs buffing. That's the bombs. Gyrocopter bombs. Right now, I think the Brimstone gun, as well as the Steam gun, has its niche value. Both units do reasonable amounts of damage for how cheap they are. The bombs, and as dwarves, you can generally defend your airspace with your own ground troops, so it's not that difficult to protect your gyros. It's just very difficult to aim the bombs. So give the bombs a proper targeting grid, make them work like a bombardment spell where your gyro flies through the area and bombs it, instead of having to twitch micro and invest stupid amounts of effort into dropping a few bombs that don't actually do that much damage. Like, they do damage, but not that insane damage. If CA is concerned about it being OP, then like make it so the gyros drop all of the bombs at once in like one go, and it just does the same damage it does now, but you only get one attack that way. But anything's better than the situation we've got now, which is super difficult to utilize. On the issue of the gyro bombers, the gyro bombers are a bit more of the issue. So gyro bombers, their projectile damage is pretty trash. It can do okay against single entities. It is one thing people like to laud this unit for, but in my experience, even single entities will kind of juke around and like stagger, and you'll waste a lot of ammo on them. It might depend on single entities, but for example, shooting Kolek with a gyro bomber in my testing did very little. he just kind of like would flinch and it would miss a bunch of shots and waste a bunch of ammo and didn't whittle him down by that much. The bombs, of course, are stupidly difficult to aim, and it's even more of an issue on gyro bombers for whom the main source of their damage is really their gyro bomber bombs. So I think obviously these guys need to have this improved bombing system. I also do think bombs could be improved damage wise. I think it would be cool to see the Skyhammer gyro bomber with its grudge or Skyhammer bomb. I think it would be cool to see it apply a slow effect, sort of like the Queen Bess. Make it so that you can, once again, control your opponent. And so you could do like an aggressive Gyrocopter build, like push towards your opponent, drop gyro bombs, that sort of thing. And it would be, in my opinion, cool to see a Queen Bess-like effect on the Skyhammer with the gyro bomber. Because look at these bombs, this big old blob of ordnance there, and for the normal gyro bomber, I don't necessarily think that you need to give it a any sort of innate buff like that. Maybe a slight cost decrease, but if the bombing grid is a little more efficient, I could see it being more effective. I think fix the bombing grid first, and then go from there. Then see if the unit is now decent enough where you can do good single entity damage and get good and then get some good bombing value. I think if those two requirements are met, perhaps we could see the gyro bomber get a little more value. Another thing I would like to see perhaps is give like the gyro bomber fear. Make it cause a little bit of fear. It is after all a giant flying monstrosity or a machine monstrosity. Either make it cause fear or make its bombs cause some sort of fear impact. So that way you can break your opponent's leadership. I think it would be cool to see the Dwarves have some leadership nerfing and nuking options, because basically every faction has some options to mess with enemy leadership, whether it's the Lure of Death or various projectile debuffs, Lure of Shadows. There's a bunch of different ways you can leadership bomb, and some factions are better than others. But giving Dwarves some options where if you pull off like a synergistic attack, you can drop enemy leadership, I think it would be cool. Like a bombing run with Gyrocopter bombers. Like these are like the TIE bombers, the Stukas of their age, and if you were having a bomber flying over your head and you literally can't do anything except shake your choppa at it, you'd probably be pretty demoralized too, I think. So I think that would be a cool way maybe to differentiate them, give those bombs leadership debuff. But those are my 2 cents. I do apologize for this was a very lengthy video, and my voice is probably gone now, and I'm probably not going to be able to speak for another few days. But I hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you found this breakdown stimulating and interesting. If you did, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and share. If you have any comments, any criticism, any questions, or your own input, and honestly, I'd love to hear what you guys have to think. I know I've got a lot of dwarf lovers on this channel. I'd love to hear what you guys have to think. If you think I've missed some units, I might have. Honestly, but let me know. If you think I'm just wrong on some of these units, maybe you get more value out of them than I do, or you find them more effective than I do. Let me know. I'd honestly love to hear. I found that like these conversations with Fixing the Forgotten, it's always interesting to see what people's take on things is, and we have a lot of different opinions, and it's cool. It's just cool to talk. It's cool to see what we all got to say, and I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about the Dowie and their state of things. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Do thank you all for your patience, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.